Hello and welcome, Connected Yoga Teachers. We're here for a live podcast episode with Trina Altman, who I'm going to bring on really soon. I just wanted to first say, if you're watching the replay, let us know in the chat, say a little hello, tell us how things are where you are, what is your understanding of somatics? Do you use somatics? Do you have some questions? I would love to hear about that in the chat. And we will come back to that if you're watching the replay, we'll come back and check in on those comments. I also want to let you know that today's episode is made possible by Pelvic Health Professionals. So if you haven't heard of this already, this is the membership that I have been hosting for over a year and a half now for yoga teachers and anyone who's interested in learning more about pelvic health. So you can go to pelvichealthprofessionals.com to check out more about that. And also the doors are open now. So if you're thinking about joining and learning more, it's a super fun place to hang out and learn a lot about how the pelvis and the pelvic floor really impacts the whole body. So I am going to welcome Trina Altman right now and do a short intro because we've heard from her on the podcast before. So Trina, welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. It's so great to have you here today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be back and to see you, and I'm excited.
Me too. So tell us, how did you get into this work of bringing somatics into the yoga class? What led you to this place?
I started, I don't know how many, maybe about 8 years ago. For about 4 years, I took regular weekly Feldenkrais classes, which are called awareness through movement classes, because there's two aspects to Feldenkrais. There's the one-on-one sessions and then the group classes. And I just fell in love with it and kept thinking, of course, as we always do, like, oh, this would be so helpful for my yoga class students. This would be so helpful for my private clients. And so that began the journey. And then I started taking a weekly class called Adult Beginner Modern Dance, which the first 45 minutes were all Bartenia fundamentals, which is another somatic movement modality. And I was horrible with the dancing part, but the first 45 minutes where we were rolling around on the ground, I loved. And I also just really appreciated how different it was from the Feldenkrais classes, but also the similarities. And then I was introduced to Hannah Somatics, probably like 18 years ago. My mom gave me the book called Somatics by Thomas Hanna because I was in pain. I was working in the corporate world and sitting at a desk all day, and she's like, maybe this will help you. And so I had read the book, and then I guess maybe like 5 years or so ago, I took a workshop with a woman who's trained in Hannah Somatics, and it was like Hannah Somatics and Yoga Workshop. And actually, I remember my friend and I, Jules Mitchell, drove out to Simi Valley, which, if you know LA, like it takes like an hour and a half to get there, even from where we were, but it's still LA. And so that kind of helped me put together things that I had gotten from the book and from, like just YouTube videos into contextualizing it with yoga. It's just, I'm one of those people who I love learning all different types of movement modalities, and somatics is not just movement, right? So there's somatic psychotherapy, somatic experiencing. So there's the like psychology, psychotherapy branch of somatics. There's the hands-on body work branch of somatics. So Ida Rolf. There's like, more of like the postural performance for actors branch of somatics, which would be Alexander technique. So if you think about how yoga has 8 limbs, and one person's yoga is chanting, and another person's yoga is pranayama, and another person's yoga is bhakti, and another person's yoga is asana, it's the same thing with somatics. So it's a really broad general term. And when I'm talking about it, I'm referring to it in terms of movement rather than the other sort of branches.
Oh, that is so good to know, because I started to look up somatics, and then I was like, oh, wait a second, why am I finding these things about psychology?
Yes.
So that's really great to know. I'm guessing then, well, I've taken online classes with you, so I probably have done somatics, and it's not like you told me, okay, this is somatics, you're doing it now. So how would we know? Like, when was the moment that you knew?
Well, I mean, if you've only taken classes with me through Yoga Anytime, I didn't have any somatics in those classes.
Okay.
So, I don't have a lot of online classes. I have maybe like 5 or 6 on Yoga Anytime, and now I have some on Yoga International. And but I taught a 12-hour yoga sequencing with somatics course back in September through Yoga International. And in my book, one of the chapters is about how I incorporate somatics. So I wasn't really, I was teaching somatics then, but I didn't include it in those classes.
Okay. So maybe I don't know what it is still. Tell us, like, what is your definition, and how might we know that we're doing it when we go to a movement class?
Well, I actually say it when I am teaching it. I'll say, I'm going to teach you a 10-minute Feldenkrais sequence. This is a sequence that would be part of a 60-minute Feldenkrais class. I am shortening and editing down because this isn't a somatics Feldenkrais class. This is a yoga class where we're going to use somatics to help you do all kinds of things. I have like a big long list that I can get to in my PowerPoint. But you'll know if you've done somatics. So if somebody's using it as an adjective, they're using it as an adjective, which I can get into. But the 3 types of somatic movements that I've studied and incorporate, and I do this so you know that I call what I teach yoga deconstructed.
Yes.
So a yoga deconstructed class for me would start with either somatics or maybe some myofascial release, sometimes, but not always. Then I would go into preparatory exercises, which is what I used to call corrective exercises, but I don't call it that anymore. I call it preparatory, which is a whole nother thing. And then I teach asana. And so because I guess I'm interdisciplinary, and when I teach Pilates, it's never just Pilates. And when I teach yoga, it's never just asana. But I do describe, like, now we're going to do a mobility drill. You might have done this, in a strength and conditioning class or an FRC, or we're going to do a somatic sequence to warm up today. This somatic sequence comes from Bartenia fundamentals or Feldenkrais or Hanna somatics. So yeah, I think you would probably know if you've experienced somatics. Somebody might be like, yeah, we're going to do somatics, and I don't know what they're talking about. You know what I mean? Like, because again, like, movement is movement. So somebody might teach down dog and say it's down dog, but in Pilates, we call it elephant, right? So a shape is a shape is a shape. A movement is a movement is a movement, but the way you would teach elephant on the reformer in Pilates, even though it's the same shape as down dog, would be probably different than how you would teach down dog in a yoga class.
This is why I love asking you these questions. I know that, like, out of all the people on this planet, I wonder if there's someone who has gone to as many movement modality classes or studied as many movement modalities as you have. Maybe you're the one on the planet that has. I want to just call out to Rania, if I'm saying this right, is saying hello from Naples, Florida. And Heidi O'Toole is also here. And I'd love to know in the comments who has done somatics, and what would you tell a friend? Like, somatics is this. So Trina, what would you say if I said, okay, I want to know what somatics is in like a short, brief statement.
Yes.
What is it?
Yes. So I will be referring, I have, I did like 4 huge PowerPoint presentations with all of the sequencing and classes for the course. So if I'm looking away, I'm just looking at my PowerPoint. So somatics is a field of study that is derived from the Greek word soma. And within the context of movement, somatics can be defined as how the mind and body are perceived from within to self-correct and heal. So Thomas Hanna, he used the term somatics as a way to define his approach to mind-body integration in order to define this field within movement education. So from a research perspective, somatics relates closely to, and it crosses over into the field of interoception, but that isn't all that it crosses over into. But if that helps you as a framework, I think it's helpful, because somatics, somatic movement modalities are not like Pilates and yoga in the sense that there aren't shapes that you know how they look when you're doing a somatics class, which brings about a whole different, because even if, say, you're doing Kundalini yoga, like you might have seen a picture in a book of somebody doing, this with the thumbs up, and like you're looking at where their arms are. That isn't the case with somatics. And so one of the reasons why I think that's really useful is it takes out the competition factor, it takes out the compare and contrast factor, it takes out the aesthetics factor, and that also carries over into cueing. So the cueing is completely different in somatics, in the sense that most of the cues are questions.
Oh, that's really cool. I love this. So it's more of an invitation. It sounds like it's very personal for people.
Yeah, for example, I fell in love with Feldenkrais because, you know me, I'm not woo-woo at all. So like a Feldenkrais class is a movement puzzle, but they don't tell you how to put the pieces together. You figure it out, and it can be different, and it is different for every person. So somatics involves tons of variability. Meaning, like, for example, if you are lying on your side with your arms, in line with your shoulders, and say you've got like a blanket under your head, your knees are bent, there's a blanket between your knees, like fetal position, super comfy and relaxed. And you're doing some palm slides. I'm like, oh, I'm on a podcast where you can see me. So when I would reach the top arm forward, certain people who maybe have only done Pilates might just reach their arm forward and not allow for any follow through to happen, say in their head or their rib cage or their thorax. Now, we wouldn't say that's right or wrong. We might just say, notice what happens when you only move your arm and your hand, versus what would happen if maybe when you move your hand and arm and reach, you also let your head or your chest move with it. And then and then comparing and contrasting in that kind of way. Like, oh, now what's it like if you take your arms at an angle that's slightly higher? And then we do the same thing there. And like, oh, are you, do you notice that, and like, if I'm teaching anatomy, I might say that something like, do you notice when you retract your scapula that it also might roll your head and chest towards the ceiling and create rotation in your spine? That wouldn't be said in a Feldenkrais class.
Okay.
But I like to use a lot of the somatic movements from Feldenkrais and Bartinieff and Hanna somatics to teach anatomy, so that when I am teaching, say, twisted triangle pose, I can refer back and be like, remember when, because as above, so below. So say if we're doing this at every angle, super slow, from here up, but also down. That's how it could be an hour-long class. And then doing the same thing, but like introducing a constraint. So now I say, interlace your fingers. And now your top knee is going to go past your bottom knee. And now your top knee is going to go behind. Right, obviously I'm cueing distal to provoke something proximal, meaning pelvic rotation. And people might have an awareness of like, oh, it's really easy for me to slide my knee forward, but it's a little harder for me to slide. It's not just their knee, it's their femur bone that's in the hip socket that's attached to their pelvis that is, it's followed through into their spine. And so you can really teach a lot of orthokinematics and osteokinematics in an embodied sort of applied way, so to speak. And then if you were to bring that, say, to twisted triangle, like sometimes in twisted triangle, maybe you want to rotate your pelvis and sometimes you don't. Remember how we, did this thing earlier where we rotated our pelvis, but then we also did it where we didn't rotate our pelvis, and you notice how it felt in your body. So maybe today you want to do twisted triangle pose and have the constraint of your pelvis not moving. Or maybe you don't,
Oh, this is really cool. I love how this is very, very subtle. And like you said, and it's a lot of asking, and someone is doing their own inquiry into that. Do you think that, like, it sounds like you'll definitely bring the somatics into a yoga class. Because we know that yoga is much more beyond the 8 limbs. Do you think that it could be considered that we are actually doing yoga when we're doing that?
The eternal argument. So for me, when I'm going to take it out of somatics and bring it into, because of how many different movement modalities I do, I feel like I'm doing yoga when I'm doing Utkatasana or chair pose, but I also feel like I'm doing yoga when I'm holding a kettlebell and doing Utkatasana or chair pose, which is called a goblet squat. Because for me, there aren't pictures in books of shapes that mean I'm doing yoga or not. Because if that were the case, then, right, like a goblet squat, which is, say, malasana, or, it's a moving malasana, or a deadlift, which is a moving Utkatasana, right? Did we say that it's not yoga because we added a block, a blanket, or a strap? No. So why would we say it's not yoga if we're adding, a kettlebell or a barbell or no props like we do in somatics, other than maybe a blanket?
Oh, I love this so much. Do you think it's the opposite then? Do you think some of us have been doing somatics in our yoga practice and not really knowing that that's what it is?
Well, I think, again, it goes back to definitions and how would you define somatics? I mentioned the crossover between somatics and interoception, because when you are practicing somatics, you're in a down-regulated state, which is also often the case when you're practicing yoga asana, not always. I'm not down-regulated when I'm doing handstand or crow pose, but I might be down-regulated when I'm doing something, that's more relaxing, like, supine yoga poses. So both, practicing yoga and practicing somatics involves hopefully being in the moment with awareness. I'm just looking at my notes over here to see if there's, yes, good, I do, because I have notes on all this. The recall. Okay, here we go. So yes. Are there any ways that somatics crosses over into the experience of yoga? Yes, there is. This is why I usually don't do video with podcasts. So I mentioned down-regulation, focusing on interoception, focus on proprioception, focusing on moving slowly, and focusing on and mindfulness. But what makes somatics different from, say, practicing yoga, asana, is, as I mentioned before, aesthetic cueing versus non-aesthetic cueing. Pendiculations. I mean, there's so many things, so I'm just, right. This is like...
What is pendiculations?
Pendiculation is like, when you wake up in the morning and you do that. And it's very different than if you put a strap around your foot and you lie on the floor and you do Supta, Pada, Gustasana, A, B, and C. Or if you see a dog stretching in down dog, it's very different than how we would do down dog in a yoga class. And so the thing that I love about somatics is, and I'll get into this, I'm going to read my notes a little bit over here just so I say things in a more cohesive way. But because we're talking about pendiculation, and that is something that's specific to HANA somatics, it's not necessarily something you would do in a Feldenkrais class or a Bartenia fundamentals class. So again, it's just like Kundalini is very different from Bikram. We can't just say yoga, like, and people would go like, oh, I do Kundalini or I do Bikram and expect they're the same. You can't just say, oh, I did somatics, because maybe you did Bartenia fundamentals, maybe you did, you know, a Feldenkrais lesson from 1962, which would be different than a Feldenkrais lesson from 1982. Just like studying with Iyengar would be different in 1982 than say it was in 2002. Right. But if I go back to Thomas Hanna and the nervous system, he was a student of Moshe Feldenkrais, and he studied philosophy and neurology. And this is way back in the 80s. And studying those two things helped him understand that physical issues could not be fully resolved without considering a person's psychology and vice versa. So here we are, biopsychosocial, before biopsychosocial was a word. So Thomas Hanna witnessed Feldenkrais demonstrating techniques on a man with cerebral palsy that resolved some of the issues in a way that a medical doctor would have deemed permanent. Because back then, we actually didn't even know about neuroplasticity. People thought that, like, once you were no longer a child, your brain was done with any changes. So Thomas Hanna invited Moshe Feldenkrais to the school, the university where Thomas Hanna was at the time, as a visiting professor, and he allowed him to lead a professional education program in the US from 1975 to 1978. So it was like the first official, you know, like, remember when there were no 200-hour teacher trainings, and then suddenly, yes. And so Hanna used somatic education to refer to the process of using movement to work with the mind and body to improve health and function. And at this point in time in the 70s, like, people weren't even really exercising that much. Like, I remember Nike shoes came out and my dad started running, but like, we didn't even have Jane Fonda aerobics. Like, we were basically, you know, people would play tennis, golf, you know, and roller skate, at least where I grew up in the 70s. So, and here's the key piece. So Thomas Hanna integrated his understanding of the nervous system into his work as a way to use movement to retrain the body and brain connection. And this is the same thing that Irmgard Bartenieff was doing so Irmgard Bartenieff studied with Rudolf, this is like a 12-hour training, but I think it's interesting. She studied with Rudolf Laban, but she was a physical therapist and a dancer. And she was seeing that physical therapists were trying to help these children who had polio, who were stiff and couldn't move, by like pulling and yanking on them like they were taffy. Hello, passive stretching, right? And that wasn't working. And she knew why it wasn't working, because there was no active part on active, you know, something happening on the part of the patient, which meant their nervous system was not involved. And so same thing with Thomas Hanna, like basically these pioneers discovered neuroplasticity, biopsychosocial approach, pain science before we had names for all of these things. So with pendiculation, getting back to that, Hanna developed voluntary pendiculation, which is a movement technique that reduces tension through movement instead of passive modalities. So if you were to think of FRC, right, with irradiation, tensing muscles, right, to create more neural drive, to tap into the nervous system to say, this movement is actually safe. See, you can create tension here and control here, versus I'm going to yank and pull and try to get more range of motion. And the nervous system goes, oh, this isn't safe. I have no control here. So he realized that voluntary movement was an effective way to retrain the nervous system. So did Irmgard Bartenieff and Feldenkrais, to improve movement patterns to reduce muscle tension and joint discomfort.
This is really amazing when all of these different people studying movement come into these same thoughts, when it's like, oh, this person over here is doing it. And when you said the biopsychosocial model, we just talked to Carolyn Van Dyken in a live podcast as well, and talked about the biopsychosocial model. She's a physiotherapist, and she talked about it in that way. I also want to call it that I really appreciate that you're doing this live. And it also, I mean, it's not everyone that I ask on to do a live interview, because there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes when we do it pre-recorded. Like, people have their notes or their dog barks and we pause it. And there's a lot of things that we can sort of take out. So I appreciate that so much. And it helps. Yeah. So because our people that are watching can then ask questions. And I would encourage you to do that. One person is saying that they have to watch the replay, and it's here for you. Don't worry about that at all. So one person on Facebook said, I've done Soma yoga in Minnesota. It was very subtle movements that left me feeling wonderful. And Virginia's saying hello to us. Hi, Virginia. So in terms of what you said at the very beginning, I made a note because I've heard you say this before. Let me grab my notes now. I've heard you say before this self-correct and heal. And I hear you talking about people who are dealing with, pain or different things that are going on in their body. So what does that look like in terms of how we could maybe bring this into our yoga classes or our one-on-one sessions with people who might be dealing with persistent pain or injuries or regular bodies that deal with the planet and gravity and all of the things that throw at it?
Yes. So there's lots of different ways in which somatics can reduce tension or pain. And, we know pain science tells us that a basic function of pain is to protect the body. So the brain might consider moving quickly or with increased effort as inherently dangerous for the muscles and joints, versus somatics, which involves moving slowly and mindfully with reduced force and effort. And this type of movement can demonstrate to your brain that a movement is safe. And so another theory of modern pain science is that we perceive pain in accordance with something called the virtual body or pain brain mapping. And so sometimes parts of the body, parts of this map, I should say, get smudged as a result of inactivity. And so somatics can help us unsmudge. So with the example of the palm slides, right, maybe that person has never really protracted and retracted their scapula very often, because they sit, they stand, they sleep, and they walk, right? And just because you're walking doesn't mean your arms are swinging. Or like they never have their arms, like when they reach their arms up, they don't know how to do upward rotation with elevation. And they can't learn it standing up because they're not feeling safe, or they're, it's much more relaxing to do it, lying down and just with very minimal effort. So, this is from Gregory Lehman, but basically when the parts of the map get smudged, this causes the brain to create pain to warn and protect us from perceived danger, regardless of whether or not it exists.
I want to pause here because a physiotherapist I've been working with since I had my herniated disc was talking to me about how maybe I could do some nerve flossing, and how it might be that there's something going on with the nerve, or it could be this smudge in my brain, which I had no idea what she was talking about. I mean, I get the pain cycle and the response that we have and the protection mechanism that we put in place, but I was pretty fascinated by that then. So this applies to a lot of our yoga students. I'm thinking of a yoga student that I worked with at one point who told me that she could not get down onto the floor. It would be too uncomfortable for her. And so we worked away, like you said, really slow and subtle movements, changing that in a way where she felt like, oh, I can do this now, you know?
Yes. Yeah. Graded exposure is usually the term that's used. So, and we have so many tools for that with yoga props, especially if you know restorative yoga. So all you do is change the orientation to gravity of the, movement skill or task that somebody is afraid of or has pain in that, maybe isn't, it might be persistent pain as opposed to acute pain, meaning like it's just an output of their brain and not necessarily a reflection of what's happening in their tissues, because at that point the tissues have healed. But I would say the other thing that's really important as far as how somatics can reduce tension or pain is somatics prioritizes variability. And yoga often does not. Right? Yes. Yoga is like, this is the pose, this is the way the pose looks. So if we think of warrior two, from a variability perspective and teaching from, say, I just taught for an online conference, and I gave an example of teaching warrior two with yoga cues that are, more alignment aesthetic. And then I taught warrior two with inquiry-based somatic cues. And just so people could see the difference and understand the difference. But say in a warrior two with a somatic cue, you might say, okay, in warrior two, I want you to aim your knee over your big toe. Now I want you to aim it over your second toe. Now I want you to aim it over your fourth toe. Now I want you to aim it over your pinky toe. And like, just introducing as opposed to being like, no, right? Your knee needs to be in this one spot that's directly above your ankle, that is centered in between all 5 of your toes. And then you just stay there and don't move. And so what happens when you have movement variability, because we know in our daily life, hopefully we have that. If we don't, we're in pain, meaning we sit at a desk all day and don't move. It's beneficial for improving proprioception and reducing discomfort in a posture position, because the part of the body that receives, and I'm reading here from my PowerPoint, mechanical stress in a movement or posture is constantly shifting, drawing awareness to the sensations that these shifts create. So in somatics, the term would be called feathering. And again, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I'm going to keep going with, so these minor changes in angles can create a sense of relief, since part of the body that might not always experience work is engaged. So a different area has an opportunity to stretch or relax. So if I were to give you an example with spinal rotation, we have 24 different vertebrae that can rotate when we move. And if each of those vertebrae participate in a small amount of rotational movement, then the rotation is going to feel easier to do. However, if one vertebra moves a lot and 5 in a row move very little, then the rotation might not feel so good. So when you would practice, say, a Feldenkrais or somatic exercise, you would be invited to turn your attention to the 5 vertebrae that were limited in mobility. Whereas in yoga, the emphasis is often more on just moving deeper into the pose and doing more rotation and grabbing a body part and making it look like the picture, rather than noticing what vertebrae are involved. And I think it's really hard to notice what vertebrae are involved unless you're doing a somatic exercise that's really slow. And like I was describing, people realizing that like, oh, when my arms are up here and I do this, I'm rotating my upper thoracic spine. I mean, they might not be using those words, right? But that's what's happening. When my arms are here and I'm doing this, I'm rotating more in my mid-thoracic. When my arms are down here, I'm rotating more in my lower thoracic. When I do it with my knees, right, I'm rotating my pelvis. But maybe if I pull my knees closer to my belly or further away, so a more acute angle or obtuse angle of hip flexion in side lying, right, that's going to create rotation maybe more in the upper lumbar versus the lower lumbar. And this is all done while you're lying on your side, super slow and relaxed. So you actually have a chance to build this awareness and proprioception in a relaxed state
Oh,
that you
that's
can
amazing.
carry over, into your yoga practice.
Okay, so two things here that I want to pull out. One is this, let's pay attention to the place that's not as mobile, not as flexible, or isn't moving as much in this movement. I think that's fantastic if we could all ask that question in our next yoga practice to ourselves. And also what you were saying about the variability, like these variations in movement. This is another thing that my PT was telling me. You know what, Shannon, you do yoga all the time. I don't think you're adding in enough variability if you're doing yoga. Like, let's look at qigong or strengthening or something that you're just not used to doing. And I think this is a great practice for us all to have. Like, I try and add that in anyway, but I do wonder, was I adding enough in? So it's a pondering. I think this is fantastic. How would we learn more about somatics? Maybe how would we try it out, I guess?
So online is a wonderful resource, right? Because everyone's been forced to go online. So you can go on YouTube and do a search for, Feldenkrais, for Somatics, for Bartenia fundamentals. And of course, there's going to be tons of videos and tons of channels. I took my classes all in person, but I was very fortunate. I live here in Los Angeles. The studio where I taught, I've always taught at interdisciplinary studios. So I taught Pilates and yoga at a studio that also had, physical therapy, gyrotonic, gyrokinesis, Feldenkrais, Laban Bartenieff, all of these things. But nowadays you can find these things online if you like to learn from books. When I taught this, and you can still, I have this 12-hour course that's specifically about how you would incorporate somatics into yoga, as opposed to, there's lots of online certifications where, like to become a Feldenkrais Guild certified practitioner is about $20,000 in 4 years of time, which is one of the reasons why I didn't do it. And I actually prefer learning in private sessions and group classes, because I like to learn little bits over time and then kind of, take little weekend trainings and things here and there. Same thing with Bartenieff. It's in New York. It's like a 2-year program to do your LMA. For Somatics, same thing. It's around a 2-year program, and you would go to the Somatics Institute, which is in Northern California. Of course, all of these, since the pandemic, full certification programs have, I'm sure, gone online, or at least partially online. So just depending if you want, if you're interested in learning about it in book form, or you can get books on somatics. I will plug my book right here, which talks about how I incorporate somatics, preparatory exercises, sensory feedback methods into yoga. But the course that I just taught on Yoga International, it was live, but then all the post-production edits are done, and you can do it at a self-paced, on your own time.
Oh, that's amazing. So can we find that all on your website, trinaaltman.com?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I can give you specific links if you want. But we have a Facebook group, and it's really, it's very thorough, because I'm very thorough, right? So there's 4 PowerPoint presentations, and then there's 4 yoga classes with all of it written out and videos. And then there's also pre-recorded videos of just the somatic sequences. So the way I did it is I wanted people to, here's a side bending, side lying. It's a bunch of pages with somatics. So I really separated everything out so everyone understood what was Bartenieff, what was Feldenkrais, what was Somatics, what a 20 to 30 minute sequence in each of those modalities would look like, and why I would sequence them with specific yoga poses. So like the example I gave with the palm slides, rotational poses, right? But there are somatic sequences that are more in the coronal plane that I would use if I'm teaching triangle pose, half moon pose, any gate pose. And so I organize the whole training around yoga teachers. So that every single somatic sequence is deconstructed to the directions of movement that are happening in each joint, and then what those directions of movement at each joint that we're exploring in the somatics would then translate into as far as yoga poses and yoga sequences go.
Wow, hats off. This sounds like a really in-depth project that you've done.
Well, what happened was, how I travel. Well, I used to travel all over the world teaching. And so I had, I still have all my private clients, but I wasn't traveling to teach. So I spent a good 4 to 5 months, creating this training with Yoga International. And yes, I'm very proud of it because it's really, I've gotten a lot of good feedback, and it's, it was just very fulfilling. So, yeah.
When you said that everything is written out, I wonder, one of our viewers here said, could you give an example of somatic cueing in another pose, just like you did in Warrior 2?
Sure. Yes. So let's see. Let me think of a pose. Okay, how about downward dog?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So, so say you're on hands and knees in quadruped, and then you lift your hips up and back, and you're in downward dog. And I would maybe start with a cue of notice your breath in downward facing dog. And let's explore what might happen when you do downward facing dog with your knees bent. How much you bend your knees is completely up to you. Maybe you explore bending your knees a lot, or maybe just a little. And as you explore bending your knees a lot or a little, maybe your heels come off the ground, or maybe they don't. What would it feel like to bend your knees with your heels on the ground versus allowing them to lift a little bit off the ground? And then once you've experienced that, maybe you choose how much you want to bend your knees, whether or not your heels stay on the ground, and you stay there for a few breaths. And you notice, and you get curious, what might happen if you turn your feet out a little bit versus having them parallel and straight forward? And now that you've sort of connected to your lower body, your feet, your ankles, your knees, your hips, let's bring our awareness to our hands and explore and notice first, where are your hands right now? And what would happen if you took your hands a little wider apart? Maybe that feels really nice. You could turn your fingers out, or you could turn your fingers in. And then what does that feel like in contrast to your feet being turned out or in? And, I'm giving you a lot of cues because I'm not doing the pose. So I wouldn't keep talking probably this much, but I'm looking at the time and I know it's 43 minutes and we're stopping soon. So I'm trying to give you a lot. And then connecting that to your spine. So what does it feel like in your shoulder blades when your fingers and hands are pointing out versus point your hands and fingers in? Do you feel any change in your shoulder blades or the position of your upper back or your spine? Same thing with your feet and your knees. Do you notice any changes in the position of your middle back or your lower back based on which direction your feet are pointing in, or whether your knees are bent or straight? Okay, let's pick a position and stay there for another 4 breaths.
I love that. That is so good. I'm so thankful for the question as well. Yogi, I want to say Yogi Matthew, but it could be Yogi Matu. I'm not sure. I want to say Matthew, but you could correct me.
But you can see how that introduces a lot of variability, a lot of empowerment. It goes completely along with pain science principles of no fear mongering, and that you are in charge, and that it's okay to explore. There aren't wrong movements or wrong movements, good movements or bad movements. We're seeing what feels maybe good today, and that might be different than what feels good tomorrow.
This is so great. Thank you for explaining and giving us some examples and really digging into a lot of the questions that we might have around somatics. And also thank you just for your attention to detail. I know that you have a tremendous attention to detail, and I really appreciate it. I love geeking out on like movement and how the body and brain work. Is there anything that you think yoga teachers really don't understand or know about somatics that you wish that they did?
Well, I think it's hard with any movement modality to understand it unless you experience it. So I would say, yeah, don't, just like if somebody told you everything there is to know, quote unquote, about yoga, and then you read a book about yoga, but you've never practiced pranayama or meditation or asana, it then becomes cognitive and top down as opposed to embodied and bottom up. And so I would just encourage you, rather than overthinking what is somatics, like just try it. Try a Bartenieff class, try a Feldenkrais class, try a Hannah Somatics class, just hop on YouTube or get in the Google and search, or, sign up for, I taught at a studio that's right outside of Seattle, and the woman who owns the studio, it's called Yoga in the Center. It's part of why we connected. She did the whole somatics training in Northern California with Eleanor Criswell, and her studio had to go online, so she teaches Hannah Somatics classes, but she also, I think, has classes that are called like somatic yoga. I have classes on Yoga International that include a lot of somatics that aren't part of the training, so I would just encourage people to get out there and explore and feel it in their body.
That's fantastic. So again, people can find you at trinaaltman.com, and I would highly recommend doing that. I love that advice. Just try it. We obviously can't understand what yoga is like if we just read a book and listened to a podcast about it.
That's
So
right.
I'm definitely going to give it a try, and I wonder if anyone else listening is also. I'd love to hear from you if you do. Thank you so much, Trina, for all of your time and wisdom today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I just appreciate the invitation and love what you do. I'm a regular listener, and so I love learning from all of the people that you have on your podcast.
We're also getting another comment. So much great information. Thank you so much, Trina and Shannon. Thank you, Alex, for sharing that comment. It's so great to see all of you here. Facebook user, it always does that to us now. Thank you. Sometimes it's Loretta. Loretta's here as one of our Facebook users. Chris also is the one who had done some Soma yoga.
Yes.
And Kim Robinson is saying thank you both very much. If you go to our YouTube, that's when we can see your name. But when you're through Facebook, it's not showing us who you are. So this has been so fun. So thank you everyone for being here live. Thank you, Trina.
Thank you. Yes.